And we are joined in studio now by Chris Pirtle of NBA Insiders, joining us here on The Last Word on Sports on SB Nation Radio. Chris, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. It's that time of the year again, and in some cases the best time of the year. The NBA is back. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Brandon. You're right. This is probably the best time of the year. Looking forward to a great season, and good to be on with you guys tonight.
Well, thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. We certainly appreciate having you on. We'll dive right into it here. A big game going on in the Eastern Conference tonight. The Detroit Pistons taking on the New York Knicks, which brings me to my first question. Obviously, one of the biggest trades so far this offseason, Carmelo Anthony going to the Oklahoma City Thunder. Are the New York Knicks better or worse without Carmelo Anthony?
Well, they were pretty bad last year, Brandon, and I don't think you could get too much worse than what they were last year. So I guess to answer your question, I think they're pretty much about the same. I think they have a much better chance to get better without Carmelo Anthony and his $26 million a year salary that he's going to earn this year. He actually has an option for next year for $27 million. So to answer your question, I don't think they're better without him yet, but I think they can get there quicker without him.
Chris, week one of the NBA regular season almost in the books now. What is your biggest takeaway from this week?
Well, John, I guess if I had to take something away, I would say that, this is going to be a long season, and that's really what I look at when I see these first couple games of the year. I say to myself, gosh, you look at teams like Minnesota, who needed a heroic effort from Jamal Crawford last night in the fourth quarter to avoid starting 0-2. I think this is a team with a ton of talent, and I just say to myself, it's a good thing this is an 82-game season, because these young guys in Minnesota are going to need every one of those 82 games to develop the cohesion and the chemistry that they're going to need to be a successful playoff team, which I think they can be. And the Boston Celtics needed a couple of good performances last night in the fourth quarter to avoid starting off 0-3. So I guess my biggest takeaway, John, is this is going to be a long season. Buckle up, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be fun.
And again, we're joined by Chris Pirtle of NBA Insiders here on The Last Word on Sports on SB Nation Radio. Chris, you just alluded to it, the Boston Celtics. You said, we're clearly seeing right now the impact of Gordon Hayward's injury right now, but going forward, what kind of impact, if any, will Gordon Hayward's injury have on Boston's ability to contend in the Eastern Conference?
Well, it's devastating, Brandon. This is a guy they invested a lot of money in, a lot of time in. Not only that, but number 2 on the depth chart behind Gordon Hayward at shooting guard is Jaylen Brown. And I would imagine the Celtics wanted to bring Jaylen Brown now is going to be thrust into the starting 5. So I think the Celtics probably wanted to bring Jaylen Brown and his development along a little slower. With Hayward being gone, now he's going to go right into the starting lineup. So that may or may not be a good thing for the Celtics as we move on long term. But it's definitely a devastating injury. The good news for the Celtics is I still think they're the second best team in the East, and I think they're still going to make the Eastern Conference Finals.
And Chris, I'm glad you brought that up. That was my next question. Who now, with Gordon Hayward likely missing the remainder of the season, and you just alluded to it in your previous answer, is Boston still the greatest challenge to Cleveland in the Eastern Conference, or would it be Washington?
Well, I still think Boston is. I still think when you've got a guy like Kyrie Irving, who is a top 15 player in this league, to go along with Al Horford and rising stars in this league like Jaylen Brown and potentially Jason Tatum, I tend to like Boston's their depth a little bit more than I like Washington. One thing that's tricky with Washington too is you always have to hope that Bradley Beal stays healthy. This guy, as we saw last year in the playoffs, was simply electric, simply sensational. And it's one of the few years that he was able to stay healthy. So if he can prove that he's going to stay healthy, the Wizards will definitely challenge Boston for that second seed in the East. But at this point, I still think the Celtics are the better team, and I think they're the ones that will ultimately face Cleveland once again in the Eastern Conference Finals.
And once again, we're joined by Chris Pirtle of NBA Insiders. Chris, I kind of have one last question for you here. Have you had I'm sure you probably haven't had the chance to check out the new arena for the Detroit Pistons, but one thing that's kind of been troubling over the past few games, and again, it's early, but the lack of attendance and the lack of a crowd for Pistons games, does a lot of that have to do with the new arena or the fact that the Pistons have just been so historically bad? And with the team that they have now, what can they do to help maybe win some of those fans back besides obviously winning games?
Well, it's a tough one. We see it all over the league. I'm in Orlando, Florida, and we have attendance issues here. But the reason for that is this team hasn't made the Eastern Conference playoffs in 5 consecutive years. So it's as simple as winning. As we know, Detroit is a great basketball city. It was my first ever favorite teams growing up back in the late 80s, watching the Pistons get their first 2 championships in 89 and 90. So it's a great basketball city, Brandon. I think they just simply have to start winning more games, and the fans will be back.
And Chris, my final question for you. Who is the biggest challenger to Golden State in the Western Conference? I think we can all agree that the Western Conference is going to be as competitive top to bottom as we've seen over the course of the last decade. But who is the biggest challenger to Golden State in the Western Conference?
Well, John, my answer may surprise you. I still think it's a team that didn't even make the playoffs last year. I think it's the Minnesota Timberwolves. Anytime you can bring in a guy like Jimmy Butler, 27 years old, entering the prime of his career, and who had his best seasons ever playing under Coach Thibodeau. Then you add Jeff Teague, who was just an All-Star 2 years ago in Atlanta. Add those 2 guys to a team that features 2 of the youngest and best superstars in the league, in Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins, and right there you've got 4 players that can play for anybody. So I like that with the combination of Coach Thibodeau, a former Coach of the Year. I think, like I said initially when we started our segment, it's a good thing this is a long season because these guys are going to need a nice long season to develop into the players I think they're going to be. But when the smoke clears at the end and there's only 2 teams left in the West, I really think it's going to be the Golden State Warriors and the Minnesota Timberwolves.
That's certainly an interesting pick, if certainly not a sexy pick. So thanks for that as well, Chris. It'll certainly be interesting to see if that comes to fruition. Chris, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. Certainly looking forward to a tremendous and exciting basketball season ahead. Thanks so much.
You got it, guys. Have a good one.